Good afternoon, dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada and co-directors of the project, Dr. Imdad Haq, Professor, Natural Resource Institute at University of Manitoba, and Professor Nirupama Agarwal, Professor of Disaster and Emergency Management, York University, I welcome all of you to the first in series of webinars planned under the Canadian Defence and Security Network project supported through Government of Canada's National Defence's Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security, in short, MINDS initiative. We are working on the thematic area called Nature-Triggered Emergency Response and Domestic Operations, and we would, number one, research existing response system, then building networks around Canadian Armed Forces, civil society actors, provincial and municipal governments, and finally prepare future generations to deal with emerging challenges. Our today's title is A Collaborative Approach to Nature-Triggered Emergency Management, Reflections from the Past Event. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is collaborating in implementing and an implementing partner of this project. Dear audience, before we begin, let me do the treaty recognition. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties made in the past, and on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves in working with partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Dear audience, we plan to conduct the webinar with the opening remarks of our project co-director, Professor Imdad Haq, and listening to our distinguished speakers next. In the order, first, we'd like to welcome Dr. Jack Raj Dilsky, followed by Dr. Christopher Ankerson, and finally, from Lieutenant Colonel retired Chris Bowen. Co-director Professor Dr. Nirupama Agarwal is going to summarize and wrap up the session at the end. Before I hand over the space to Professor Imdad, let me have the privilege to introduce our speakers. As I have already indicated, first in line of our speaker is Professor Dr. Jack Raj Dilsky. He is an Associate Professor of Disaster and Emergency Management, York University, Toronto, Canada. His professional work involves research, teaching, and services related to a variety of topics in emergency management. Professor Raj Dilsky is a subject matter expert in topics related to disasters, emergency management, and homeland security. Dear audience, Professor Jack has a website. You can learn more about him if you go to rajdilsky.com. Welcome, Professor Jack. Next, we have Dr. Christopher Ankerson, who is a clinical professor of global affairs. He leads the global risk specialization as part of the MS in Global Affairs degree at CGA. Prior to joining New York University, Dr. Christopher Ankerson worked at the United Nations from 2005 to 17. He held a number of posts, including that of Security Advisor for the United Nations system in Thailand, as well as other appointments at the UN assistance to the Khmer Rouge trials in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, the UN offices in Geneva and Vienna, and at the Department of Safety and Security in New York. He has taught at London School of Economics, the London Centre for International Relations, King's College London, Carleton University, and Royal Military College of Canada. Currently, Dr. Ankerson is a research fellow at the Canadian Defence Association Institute, Senior Research Fellow at the German Southeast Asian Center of Excellence for Public Policy and Good Governance, Faculty of Law, Tham Stat University, Bangkok, and Honorary Fellow at the Policy Insights Forum. His warm welcome also, Professor Dr. Christopher. And finally, we have Lieutenant Colonel retired Chris Bowen, who served as an air navigator and later as Air Combat System Officer for 35 years, and he spent in air operations in Canadian Armed Forces, in flight testing, NATO and domestic staffs, training and educational roles. He received a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Science and a Master of Defense Studies. He retired in 2022 from Canadian Forces College. Welcome, Colonel Chris, to this session as well. And I'm requesting the speakers to kindly introduce their topics as they go in during the presentation. Now, let me welcome Professor Emdad for his opening remarks. Professor Emdad, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kasar Ahmed. Good morning and good evening. This is our first webinar, and the topic today is the role of armed forces in nature-triggered extreme events. I would like to be brief and highlight few critical points. If we look at nature-triggered events globally, the trend is quite obvious. We haven't seen billion-dollar disaster events prior to 1980s, but since the mid-1980s, things got totally changed in Canada. We have seen several extreme events per year, which costed the nation more than $1 billion. It ranged from $1 to $5-6 billion. And the events involved ice storms, flooding, forest fires. Globally speaking, the world began to experience loss of more than $100 billion again since the 1980s. And the cost is accumulating, particularly with the climate change extreme events. No nation alone, by mobilizing the civil institutions, can handle and deal with such extreme events. But there are two major aspects involved with human response systems. Number one is the humanitarian aspects to save human lives, and that's global human concerns led by the United Nations, and all nations are involved with it. The other aspect, that number two, is related to economic loss reduction. In short, these days, we call it DRR, disaster risk reduction. Now, these two aspects, that immediate response to critical emergency from humanitarian perspective, one of the best institutions that each nation has is the armed forces. It's primarily because the armed forces has the very unique training and command and control systems. For immediate and urgent emergency, that command and control system works best. But the involvement of armed forces becomes complex when it relates to disaster risk reduction, because that relates to societal and human dimensions. In Canada, if we look at the armed forces involvement, it relates to civil defense history since the Cold War period. After the Second World War, we have gone through this that phase, and civil defense training and command and control system involved armed forces directly or indirectly. But gradually, as I noted earlier, that the cost became accumulated. Canada, like other developed countries, succeeded in reducing the loss of human lives, whereas we lost ground in terms of economic losses cumulatively. So we won in one sector, that is in terms of saving lives, in terms of rescue. I'm sure that everybody knows about coastal rescue and so on, that saves sailors' lives and so on. So we have huge milestone of success in those areas, whereas we lost ground where big cities became concentration of infrastructure, people, and other economic assets. So when we are facing today, in the contemporary context, a huge challenge from climate change and related events with mega disasters, and also we are finding new phenomena, like river or storms or rain bomb, all of those things. With these new scenarios, the armed forces, their role, their involvement is inevitable. But the issues come up with cost effectiveness, because training the armed forces involve huge amount of national resources, and their primary responsibility is to save the country from external threats. However, the humanitarian role and also economic loss reduction cannot be denied. So the big academic dilemma, professional dilemma, is that what should be the role of armed forces? Today, our speakers will highlight from their own personal experience, from their academic knowledge, from their professional knowledge, to highlight on the roles of armed forces and how these should be modified and improved. So, in the context of climate change, it's not a national issue, it's an international issue, it's a global issue. So, the webinar that we are presenting today or holding it today is not just in the context of Canada, it is relevant to other nations as well. So, I would like to finish it here. I would like to hear from all our speakers and a synthesis from Dr. Nirupama Agrawal. Back to Dr. Kausar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Imdad. Ladies and gentlemen, I totally forgot to introduce lecturer Musarrat Jaman from Bangladesh University of Professional in Dhaka Disaster Management Faculty. She has joined us from Bangladesh, as well as we have our research assistant, Mohammed Sadman Saqib, who actually helped me to organize this whole session. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us from Bangladesh. It's almost midnight there. So, ladies and gentlemen, and the audience, let's welcome Dr. Jack Raj Dilsky first for his wonderful presentation. He has prepared slides for us, and I'm going to share the slides with permission from Dr. Jack. Professor Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad, Dr. Haq, and Dr. Agrawal for setting the stage and providing a kind introduction. What I'm going to do is present some information on defense support of civil authorities in the United States and emergency management context, and the importance of presenting information from this perspective is so that we can establish what the United States does, how military affairs relate to emergency management, but perhaps B, more importantly, consider how this can compare and contrast to situations that happen in Canada and other places when the military becomes involved in disaster management. I'll plan for my presentation to run for approximately 15 to 17 minutes. Next slide. By way of introduction, I'm an associate professor of disaster and emergency management at York University. My doctorate is from Michigan State University. Prior to joining the faculty at York, I was a professor of disaster and emergency management in the United States for 11 years. In general, my work relates to topics of all hazards, emergency management, and five phases, and the 5 phases of emergency management. My current activities relate to the study of terrorism and non-routine hazards of social origin. And currently this summer, some of my research topics involve looking at the extraordinary use of governmental powers with Canada's Emergencies Act, which were based on what happened in February 2022 in response to the so-called Freedom Convoy's occupation of the city of Ottawa and the subsequent blockades at international border crossings. If in the event any listeners or viewers would like to receive the link to the slides for the presentation, I can be contacted at my email, rozdilsk@yorku.ca. Next slide. The purposes of this presentation are to provide a top-level overview of the doctrine that guides how the U.S. military gets involved in disaster management. I'm also going to attempt to position defense support of civil authorities in the context of the American emergency management system. I'm going to do that by highlighting the roles of various systems in the United States in the context of civil military affairs. And at the end, I'm going to briefly mention some of the important legal limits to these activities. And I'm also going to allude to some of the controversy related to the former Trump administration's controversial actions of attempting to involve the United States military in civil affairs during perceived emergencies. Next slide. A note on the perspective. Perspective in this presentation is provided from a United States emergency management view. It's very complicated. There are a lot of acronyms, so please keep in mind for the next 14 minutes or so, this is an overview only, but my hope is that this overview can be used to compare and contrast, perhaps, Canada's civil military affairs during disasters, which do have some differences from how the U.S. handles these affairs. Next slide. Also, a brief note on nomenclature. In Canadian English, defense is spelled with a C, not an S. But for many portions of my presentation, I'm probably going to be using the S in spelling of defense. Next slide. I'm going to start out with providing an emergency management background and context based on systems that the United States uses for emergency management and homeland security. And I'm going to go back to the United States National Preparedness Goal, which was established in 2011. Next slide. That the National Preparedness Goal was established by President Obama under Presidential Policy Directive 8, National Preparedness. And what that Presidential Policy Directive did was establish a doctrine to meet the needs during times of crisis and emergencies in 5 mission areas: prevention, protection, mitigation, recovery, and response. And for those of you who are familiar with emergency management, those are what we consider as the 5 phases of disaster management. Next slide. Now, in looking at the National Preparedness Goal, in the United States, the National Preparedness Goal is supported by 5 national planning frameworks. And these national planning frameworks are designated for each one of the 5 mission areas. So in other words, you have a series of doctrines, pieces of doctrine created, which are books ranging in the hundreds of pages, which describe in detail how each one of these management phases should ideally operate in the American context. So you have your national framework for prevention. There is a national framework for protection. Next slide. A national framework exists for mitigation. A national framework exists for recovery. Next slide. And a national framework exists for response. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the National Response Framework, or NRF. That National Response Framework is built upon something that's called the National Incident Management System, or Nems. Next slide. The Incident Command System is an element of the command and management component of Nems, where ICS has become the standard for on-scene emergency management across America, where it allows for state, federal, and other agencies to operate under a common system. And we see ICS applied in many other contexts around the globe, or similar versions of ICS applied. For example, here I'm in Toronto, and in Ontario, we operate by something known as IMS, or the Incident Management System, but it does have similarities to the Incident Command System. Next slide. And as we see, the incident command system is based on an organization divided into operations, planning, logistics, and finance and administration, all under a command staff led by an incident commander. Next slide. Now, the relationship of Nems to the National Response Framework is that the National Incident Management System, or Nems, defines how it needs to be done using a standardized, consistent incident management system, or ICS, where the National Response Framework, or NRF, defines what needs to be done to manage a major incident, and that is based on a series of principles. Next slide. The National Response Framework, or NRF, presents the guiding principles that enable all response partners to prepare for and provide for unified national response for emergencies and disasters. Where built upon the National Incident Management System, the NRF overlay provides a consistent template for managing incidents. Next slide. The NRF includes something that's called ESFs and annexes. ESF is an emergency support function, where emergency support functions describe how to group resources and capabilities into functional areas. Emergency support functions also provide the structure for coordination of federal interagency support. There are 15 named emergency support functions that represent many disaster-related disciplines. Next slide. And what this slide depicts by name are the 15 emergency support functions. And we can see they range from transportation to firefighting to logistics to energy to public safety and security. So we have a wide range of necessary disaster management disciplines encompassed under the emergency support functions. Next slide. Now, what you see on this screen are the U.S. acronyms for numerous federal government agencies which play support roles for the person power and the tools and techniques that are used for supporting disaster operations through emergency support functions. So what we generally are thinking about here is a whole of government approach, incorporating many different government agencies into an overall national preparedness setting. Next slide. What this diagram shows is a table that designates the support of the 15 emergency support functions by coordination, primary, and secondary support agencies. Now, the table is too small to see, but the important point is that there are 15 emergency support functions that you see in the red shaded box along the x-axis, and then going along the y-axis of the table, you see a list of all the acronyms for the government agencies. And what the table does is it depicts which government agencies play support roles for emergency support functions in support of the National Response Framework. Next slide. Now, for the topic at hand, the United States Department of Defense, or military, they have very specific roles in supporting the emergency support functions, where the Department of Defense plays a supporting role for 14 of the emergency support functions. And by the design of the doctrine, the Department of Defense plays a primary role for one of the emergency support functions, that is ESF9, Search and Rescue. Next slide. This shows a brief example of Department of Defense playing a support role for emergency support function number 1, transportation. And again, this is a screenshot taken directly from the doctrine, but it highlights that the Department of Defense provides military transportation capacity from the United States Transportation Command, known as U.S. Transcom. Next slide. So what that would translate to on the ground, U.S. Transcom military air capacity based out of Scott Air Force Base in southern Illinois through the United States Transportation Command can, in certain circumstances, be made available for disaster management. Next slide. During Hurricane Katrina, U.S. Transcom played roles supporting FEMA. Next slide. U.S. military air assets to support FEMA during Hurricane Katrina were used under the arrangement for military support for civilian disaster management purposes through the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Next slide. Now, the guiding doctrine from the defense viewpoint is the Defense Support of Civil Authorities Joint Publication 3-28 of 2018. And what's important about this, the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the governors of an effective state, makes a request to use forces that are designated under Title 32 of United States Code. What Title 32 is it's where it outlines the roles of the National Guard. Next slide. Where the National Guard is a state-based military force, which is the reserve component of the U.S. federal military. Next slide. An example of an activation was during the Los Angeles riots of 1992, where President Bush made a federal disaster declaration under the Stafford Act, along with invoking the Insurrection Act to quell the Los Angeles riots. Now, in this case, under a rare Title 10 authority, the California Army National Guard was called into federal service. Next slide. So in this example, the California Army Guard was being federalized under very specific circumstances in 1992, which resulted in boots on the ground to help deter rioting and looting, as local Los Angeles Police Department and state California Highway Patrol officers were overwhelmed with the situation of civil disorder in 1992 in Los Angeles. Now, defense support of civil authorities takes place in a very specific legal environment in the United States, where key legal considerations include the Stafford Act and other legal guidance from the Economy Act, military support to civil law enforcement, the Posse Comitatus Act, which provides specific limitations on use of military force in domestic circumstances, the Insurrection Act, where the president has the authority to override much of this in the case of extreme emergencies, and that's all done under the context of very specific Department of Defense directives. Next slide. Now, all of these things we're talking about are not abstract theory. Interesting, and many interesting circumstances in the past few years, there has been a recent controversy with former President Trump's action during 2020, where I was involved in researching some of those circumstances, and this was an op-ed I published. Trump's threat to use the Insurrection Act against protesters is an abuse of power. Next slide. This is another example of an article from the Just Security Group that Trump can't lawfully use the armed forces to sway the election, understanding the legal boundaries. And we see many of these topics returning right now in the context of the January 6th insurrection hearings taking place in Washington, where some of these topics are coming to light under further investigation in relationship to how military forces can and cannot be used in domestic circumstances. Next slide. So in conclusion, the military has a long history in the United States of providing support to civil authorities, particularly in respect to disasters, but for other purposes as well. The defense support of civil authorities in response to disasters is typically carried out in accordance with the National Response Framework and National Guard involvement. And Department of Defense organizations both adopt and implement procedures consistent with the National Incident Management System and the Incident Command System. Next slide. And that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Jack Raj Dilsky, for, I would say, a very wonderful and succinct presentation about the, the legal parameters and the way that disaster management is handled in the U.S. The audience, now it's time to welcome Professor Dr. Christopher Ankerson for his presentation, and I'm going to promise that this is going to be another fascinating presentation for all of us. Professor Christopher, floor is yours, sir, and I'm going to share your presentation with your permission.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me here. Thanks very much for setting the stage. So I'm going to look at the notion of blurred boundaries within disaster response within the Canadian context. A little bit of what I'm going to be mentioning is very similar to what Jack talked about in a different context, so we can see some of the generalizability of some of the conundrums and challenges. Next slide, please.
Professor Christopher, the control is with you.
Oh, great. Perfect then. So military disaster response, and by this we mean something very specific in terms of military responding to natural disasters or natural triggered disasters, as opposed to responding to issues of national security or public unrest. So military disaster response is supposed to be easy in the sense that there are a number of aspects that make it far less complicated, far less politically difficult than what we see when the military gets involved in responding to riots, for example, or responding to other forms of public unrest. The first of all is that, as mentioned in the introduction, militaries have capabilities. They have not only command and control, but they have vehicles. They have, as Jack was mentioning, they have recourse to large capacity logistical aircraft, etc. And they also have capacity. They don't just have one of these things. They have large amounts of these, including people that are largely spread around the country. So it makes this an easy capability and capacity to harness. Militaries also have the advantage of already being paid for. While there are mechanisms for charging back military services to provinces or municipalities, that very rarely happens. The logic being, we've already have a defense budget. The soldiers are already being paid to be literally on standby for, let's say, the next war, and therefore using those, diverting that capacity and those capabilities, it incurs no extra or no additional cost, and therefore it is often the easy response. And then lastly, responses to disasters, while they are clearly tragic for the people involved, they're often a good news story in the sense that people, through polling, like it when the military shows up in their community to assist with forest fires, assist with flooding, assist with snow removal, for example. So it's generally considered to be much more simple and straightforward than the other kinds of military domestic operations. But in reality, despite this easiness, these operations do pose challenges. The first is often expressed by military leaders, including the current Chief of Defense Staff, General Wayne Eyre, that disaster response robs time from other activities, whether that is training, whether that is recruitment, whether that is maintenance. Having to respond to floods, forest fires, etc., is not actually just, the soldiers aren't just quote unquote sitting around waiting for things to happen. They have very full schedules in terms of preparedness for overseas missions, for reconstitution, for example. The training of recruits, the actual physical recruitment process. So anytime you're taking people out of what they're normally scheduled to do, you're causing a disruption to those very tight timetables. The second issue, the second challenge, is that this easiness that I mentioned in the previous slide can become too easy. For example, writing in the United States, Rosa Brooks talks about the military being like the Walmart option. In some senses, it is too easy. If you have a problem that requires some kind of response from the government, then the military almost becomes too tempting to use. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And clearly, point 1 and 2 on this slide are amplifying that. The easier it becomes to use the military, the more perhaps the military feels that it is being robbed of its other time and focus. And therefore, we see ourselves running into a number of blurred boundaries, despite this easiness, despite the kind of the fact that these disaster triggered or natural disaster responses are supposed to be the better option. Nobody likes to send militaries into prisons. No one likes to send militaries into crowd situations. So responding to a forest fire or a flood or a snow emergency is actually supposed to be the easy thing. But I want to problematize that. It actually isn't all that simple and straightforward. And we have a number of situations that lack some clarity. The first is there's a blurring now between the last resort and the only option. Clearly, no one is suggesting that in a crisis, when a disaster hits, if the military is available, then nobody's saying they shouldn't be sent in there. Clearly, here we see, for example, sailors responding to a First Nation after a wildfire. That is a good thing to have happen. It is a good government option. However, it's meant to be a form of last resort. What we tend not to see is actually the building or the construction of any other kinds of options. So, for example, when Canadian Armed Forces personnel responded to northern and remote communities during the rollout of the COVID vaccine, this was considered to be an appropriate use of the military. But the question becomes, well, what would you do if this became a routine activity? Where is the civilian capacity? Is it always going to be the military that does it? Or would another federal department or perhaps even a private option be there? If not, if you're not building another option, then the military really has to kind of prepare itself for the fact that it is going to be the last resort much more frequently. Another blurring is between once in a while and business as usual. So again, the military tends to regard this notion of we fight forest fires once in a while, for example, and therefore soldiers in some simplified sort, drop their rifles and pick up shovels and they go and respond. And there's not a lot of preparation that's done. You can rely on the existing capacity, the existing capability, as was mentioned, command and control, discipline, the ability to manage projects, for example, but you're not actually preparing in any particular specific way. But what happens when that once in a while starts to become business as usual? So instead of one summer out of 10, are you going to be doing forest fire response? What happens when that becomes every summer, for example? Should you start to routinize that? Should you start to institutionalize that? Should you start to systematize that? So, for example, should soldiers take a forest fire fighting course? Should there be a 3-week kind of basic trades course where soldiers are actually trained how to do this, rather than just having this again, drop your rifle, pick up a shovel type approach to this? And what would the wider implications of that be if you were to have that kind of training, if you were to necessitate that kind of training? What is being sacrificed? As I said, what are you actually giving up in order to make time and room for that kind of preparation? Probably more worrisome, we start to see a blur between safety and security. Not all the time, but in some cases. So despite being deployed to assist with improving safety, so actually dealing with natural disasters, so to speak. There have been occasions when the Canadian Armed Forces has been deployed, but then has been asked to, or taken on its own initiative, and strayed into areas of providing security. For example, during some flooding in Alberta, the RCMP asked the military while it was there to assist with house-to-house searches looking for things like improperly stored weapons, for example. And this caused a lot of controversy. The military was called out for response to a natural disaster under one component of the National Defense Act, but was being asked by the civilian law enforcement to assist with a non-disaster related task. And this was quite controversial. Another example might be when the armed forces took it upon itself to respond to a provincial call during COVID to help with monitoring social media. How was the provincial rollout of vaccines and the lockdown processes, how was that being interpreted by the civilian population? And the Canadian Armed Forces used its capabilities to help answer this question. This again was very controversial. This is actually not about responding to a natural disaster. It's starting to provide other kinds of assistance that should have been requested under different articles of the National Defense Act, for example. And then lastly, we have this blur between agent and auditor. So often the agent the Canadian Armed Forces acts merely as an agent. It's requested to assist in natural disasters, and it merely asks how high. Where do you want us? Let's do kind of a reconnaissance to figure out how many troops are required, what kind of equipment, for example, is required. But there's been at least one example now where the Canadian Armed Forces has been put into a position where it's felt compelled to have to comment on how well the provincial response has been. So, for example, during the COVID response to long-term care facilities in Ontario and Quebec, the military was requested to come in and provide some medical assistance in the running of those long-term care facilities. And what they found when they got in there was extremely unsatisfying. The level of or the level of care, the standard of care that the residents of those care facilities was receiving was so shockingly bad that the Canadian Armed Forces felt compelled to kind of put up a red flag, as it were, and make their observations known. Now, that was appropriate, was a largely medical-led intervention, but it put the Canadian Armed Forces into a very particular situation where now it's having to comment on the civilian capability that it is meant to merely augment. And you can imagine in the future, what do you do when you get called out, for example, to a flood or a forest fire situation, and you find that there is very little planning done, or the civilian response is poorly executed? Is the military being put in a position now where it's no longer just the agent, but now is going to be compelled to make what can be seen as politically controversial commentary? So what are we going to do here? And as was already mentioned in the introduction, disasters are very much likely to increase not only in frequency, but in intensity and increasingly in complexity as we start to see the effects of climate disasters interact with other political issues, for example. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves in the Canadian context, what is the national strategy and framework? We don't particularly have a strong national capacity, national strategy and framework. It's very much a patchwork of provincial responses, a patchwork of different styles and approaches to this. And then the question becomes, within that national strategy and framework, what role should the Canadian Armed Forces play? Should this be, for example, akin to the way the American military does this? Should this be a role for the reserves, for example? Is this something that the Canadian military should dedicate particular forces, whether those are militia units or they are some element of their own units to that? And how should it best prepare? As I said, should it be including in command and control exercises? Should it be including an element where you're preparing for and training specifically for flood response? How to operate pumps? What's the best way to construct a levee, for example? Or in terms of forest fires, as I said, should soldiers be more expert in how to do a fire break, for example? Right now, they often show up and are directed by sometimes civilian staff, professional forest fire fighters, but if this becomes more than just once in a while, should the Canadian Armed Forces actually take this as a standing task as opposed to a be prepared to every once in a while type activity? Great. And with that, I will end and look forward to the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Christopher Ankerson, for another wonderful round of presentation. And he presented about the challenges of deploying Canadian Armed Forces to not only natural disaster, but also in some cases putting Armed Forces members in controversy while dealing with civil disturbances. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time to welcome Colonel Chris Bowen, who was waiting patiently to deliver his presentation. Chris, floor is yours, and I'm going to share your slide now with your permission, sir. Chris, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Causer. Hello, everybody. Yeah, good morning and good afternoon to you wherever you are. I'm going to kind of expand on what Jack and Christopher have talked about and kind of apply those concepts to a case study, the 1997 Red River flood. I was in fact posted in Winnipeg at the time, so I have a little bit of firsthand knowledge. So I'll just tell a story about how the Canadian Armed Forces assisted in that disaster. Next slide, please. There we go. So I'll talk about the ongoing CAF issues at the time in 1997. There was significant turmoil inside the CAF, not related to the flood, but related to structural issues, et cetera, in the CAF. So there was ongoing CAF issues, and we'll talk about a few of those. We'll talk politics. Politics plays a huge role in any kind of disaster response. So to put it in context, I typically, when I was in the domestic headquarters, I would typically be in charge of putting together a response, doing planning, making sure we had the appropriate resources, et cetera. So of a lot of these discussions, a lot of these disasters. However, I did play a role at the operational level as well. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline about the flood, which is kind of it's an interesting study in how much time things take. We'll talk about operation assistance, which was applied to the a little bit about command, control, and communications, because if you're in the military, no day will go by without talking about command, control, and communications. And further, and that have been exposed by we've encountered so far, but particularly in the Red River flood. Next slide, please. So at the time, in 1997, we were under the Chrétien government, and the government mandated a relatively drastic reduction in the Canadian Armed Forces over the time period from when the Chrétien government was first put in place in 1993 down to 1997. So the government mandated a 25% reduction in the CAF across the board. And we were also in the aftermath of the Bosnian War. We were kind of in an interwar period between Bosnia and Kosovo. We weren't sure if we were going to deploy to Kosovo or not. We were in what is affectionately known as the decade of darkness from a CAF perspective. The CAF, that was the kind of bandied in those years. We were also after the Somalia affair, the Somalia Commission, which was just wrapping up. Some toxic leader was exposed by the Somalia Commission and the work that they do. They didn't finish their work. They were shut down by the government, but up to the point where the Somalia Commission had some very, very, very critical remarks about CAF leadership inside the CAF. We'd also been exposed as unable to integrate genders properly. We were ordered to do so in the late 80s, and the CAF leadership at the time slow rolled the integration of gender fight. Antoine and Otto, she's written a very good book. He's in the CAF. And maybe one of the most things going on in sexual misconduct. And you don't have too many claims articles to critical those issues were. Next slide, please. So on the political front, and from a staff officer's perspective, there's many political threads that you have to deal with when you're a military planner. You just can't get away from it. So one of the things that we can do to better prepare ourselves as a military is understand the political landscape. However, so a little bit of a timeline. Right in the middle of the flood on the 3rd of May, Prime Minister Chrétien visited Winnipeg for a photo op, and immediately the next day calls a national election early for June 2nd. He didn't have to call the election, but he called it early and right in the middle of the Winnipeg flood. This set off a lot of shockwaves in the country. Let's just say that, and a political analysis of that, I wouldn't be able to do that. But as a Canadian Armed Forces person deploying there, this would have been quite unnecessary news at the time. So he called it early, and he figured he could get a majority again in 1990. Was his thinking at the time, but that was a shockwave inspiration. And on the political front as well, there's sometimes an uneasy relationship between a provincial and a federal politics. We've already talked about Toronto snow shoveling and COVID funds. So depending on the governments in place and on the federal and provincial side, there can be a good relationship, can be a not so good relationship. So that factors into your planning and your timelines as you're working your way through your plan as a military planner. Next slide, please. So working on the timeline, was probably when the CAF was mostly up to speed and operating in the area. So they were soldiers on the ground were 24 hours a day building dikes. And this rescue you see on the right is a Labrador helicopter hoisting people off of their roofs. That's how fast the water had risen. And we were also dropping flares at night for the 24/7 kind of dike building process. So it gets awfully dark out in the prairies. There's no ambient lighting. So dropping flares was a task so that people could effectively build dikes. On the 28th, LaSalle and Sanford were evacuated the 29th. Sinagath dike breached. St. Norbert was evacuated the 30th. Comment from the Sunday Free Press, the drones and military helicopters and planes filled the sky. The 1st of May, Ottawa advanced some assistance money. In the $20-30 million range, I believe, and it's quite a small context. But again, politics plays a role in the public's minds, and so Ottawa, I think, believed they needed to be seen to be doing something. And on the 2nd of May, Grand Point was flooded to save the city of Winnipeg, and they in fact also stopped sandbagging machines, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide, please. And so this is just, again, a summary of what was going on and a little bit of map that was in the Winnipeg Free Press. Credit to my wife, who actually saved the newspapers from the time. So I this is my stash of newspapers. So by the 6th of May, still the floodway was beyond record amounts of water. Bridges were closed, dikes were deteriorating, but the flood. Things are starting to possibly look up on the 6th. Next slide. So on May the 3rd, more than 8,500 CAF people were deployed. This is one of the largest sometime. You can see obviously air assets are agile and able to get to the areas needed. You've seen a map of the floodplain of the Red River. It's a vast area that was flooded. The Navy was deployed, 56 boats and crews, mostly from Naval Reserve units across the country. The Naval Reserve in Canada operates the small boats. And the Army, of course, you just need boots on the ground, as we already talked about, 6,000 people from the Army in Winnipeg. I was just leaving Winnipeg for Brandon and Edmonton. So there's relatively few Army folks in Winnipeg permanently. And that's true of many regions of Canada. So when you're planning a deployment of that many people, you really have to do a lot of time, speed, distance calculations to get the people on the ground as fast as possible, just given where they live. The Army was deployed across the flood area, had small teams that were across the flood area and communicating back to an HQ at the Winnipeg Airport, which is high ground in the city. So who plans it all? Who controls it all? Who's in charge? And we've already kind of broached that topic there. Christopher kind of broached that topic. It's a delicate balance at times. Provincial governments are fully responsible by the law for disaster response and emergencies in their provinces, and they are funded to do so, or they should be funded to do so. But the CAF is used to being in charge. You know, when the CAF goes somewhere, they are in charge, have their own command and control capabilities. The provinces have varying levels of ability to command ops. Each province is completely different. There's not a lot of uniformity across the provinces in their conceptual, how they operate, where they operate from. So the provincial authorities are a key target of Joint Task Force staffs in that province. You really need to understand these people and what they think they should be doing. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about sandbagging. The sandbagging case study is pretty interesting in the Winnipeg flood. So they had sandbag machines in a lower technology environment. A great big pile of dirt gets dropped off, and you got people with shovels and bags, and it's done hydraulically. But in the Winnipeg case, sandbag machines were brought in. and operating. So you need, your biggest problem is distributing the sandbags. So they had an Apple, and you have to do the math of how much water is coming at you and how big you need your dikes. But the bottom line is they had enough sandbag production. But they failed to plan properly, and they actually turned off these machines when they should have kept them running. So a couple neighborhoods were flooded as a result, and there was a bit of disorganization. So, who plans and controls these operations? Who does the risk management? Who decides what doesn't get sandbagged? All pretty critical questions, especially population. Next slide, please. And communication. It is somewhat frightening as a Canadian Armed Forces person deploying on one of these operations that you will actually be able to talk to somebody because the RCMP, local police forces, local fire departments, and it is quite astonishing to find out you can't actually talk to people. And in 1997, over that vast space in Winnipeg and the prairies, there was no cell phone, no effective cell phone system. So what you need is long-range communications, and the military comes with long-range communications. However, the provincial authorities do not have ability. So it's quite interesting. And for instance, if we talked about the naval reserves that came with small boats, they typically have handheld radios that are on VHF FM, whereas an aircraft may not have that capability. So if you're flying along in an aircraft and you see a small boat, you're in the Air Force, they're in the Navy, but you can't actually talk to each other. So the communication and communication planning is actually pretty critical in a disaster like this, where the communication infrastructure is very, very weak. It's notable that in Auckland, New Zealand, earthquake recently, cell signal were the first to regenerate after the earthquake. It was really within a day there was cell phone signals throughout the area. They'd set up mobile towers and mobile capability. So the infrastructure, the landlines were going to be down forever, but the mobile phone signals actually are quite flexible now. So that's something to keep in mind in the future. Mobile phone companies really like making money, and they're really good at setting up quickly, getting their towers back in operation. Next slide, please. So we talked about need resource. The province doesn't have a capability. They're going to ask for that capability all the way up to the federal government until they can find the ability that you need. Next slide, please. And you're going to have a location where these capabilities go to. In the Winnipeg case, it was quite a large area, but you're going to have a location. You're going to have a local authority with an emergency operations center. You're going to have a provincial, then you're going to have the federal government. You're going to have all these people involved. Next slide, please. So I believe it was Jack mentioned the incident command system. Similar system in Canada. It is common across the country. Every provincial authority uses this incident command system. It was developed, I believe, during some California wildfires that went sideways quite some time ago. They recognized the need to have a command system. So it is a military-style system applied to a civilian agency. Next slide, please. This proves to be quite difficult to manage. When you have an organization like this, and then you overlay whatever the CAF comes with, whatever capabilities you come with, you overlay onto this. So, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. Don't necessarily. Thing is really to achieve full level of coordination between the CAF and your, if you're working out of a pre-OC. So while it is military style, there's significant issues with how these systems are managed, who manages them, and how they're all kind of connected together. Typically, provincial emergency management organizations have a significant part-time personnel component to them. So the people sitting in these chairs, typically color-coded deskers, they full-time people are not, they don't necessarily exactly know what they're doing. They can be very inexperienced part-time people. So provinces do not keep pre-ocs fully with personnel all year round. They kind of surge and relax them. So you don't necessarily have a full-time knowledgeable emergency management staff there in the provincial operations center either. Next slide, please. So in the Winnipeg flood case, there was a pre-OC in Winnipeg. There was the CAF headquarters at the Winnipeg airport. The CAF had strategic long-range communications. The pre-OC did not. Typically, the CAF has only one or two liaison officers inside the pre-OC that try to communicate outwards to the CAF HQs. All that was going on, and particularly in the Winnipeg flood, the water rose very, very quickly. So time is of the essence, so what should happen are these two things side by side, these parallel timelines. So on the left, you'll see the province, and on the right, you'll see the military actions, and these have to happen in sequence. Not all the same stuff, but you got to try and integrate these timelines. So the province obviously don't have a problem they can't solve. They sent a letter to the federal minister of public safety, of what exactly they need. On the CAF side, the liaison officer to the emergency management organization is made aware, understands what the letter says, and probably has advised the provincial officials on what capabilities the CAF could offer that would meet their needs. Typically, the province doesn't necessarily understand the CAF or what the CAF has, so there has to be negotiation. And the operational commands in Canada begin their contingency planning. Once the Minister of Public Safety, the Prime Minister, and the Premier of the province agreement, there's negotiations. There is a cost component, but I believe Christopher mentioned it's rarely optioned by the federal government. The provinces don't pay, essentially. And a CAF deployment gets approved. And at the point of time where the approval of CAF deployment happens, the CAF needs to be ready to go. So there's a huge amount of preparation in the background before the order is given on the CAF side. So there's a warning order, large amounts of activity. Getting 8,000 troops to Winnipeg is quite a feat. So all these things are happening in parallel. So the actual formal approval of a CAF deployment is almost you don't even need it at that point. Everything is set in motion. This is just the dotting the I's and crossing the T. Then the time elapses. There's a deployment. There's a command and control arrangement, either tight or loose, or something you can manage on both sides, provincial and CAF. And then you're employing troops. So now, next slide, please. So the Red River case, it wasn't unknown that was going to be a flood. It wasn't unknown that was going to be a large flood. There's quite a lot of surveillance and warning, Red River. So the planning happened. However, a big factor in how fast the water rose, and the deployment of that much CAF capability is you might be late if you don't plan properly and you don't have proper contingency plans in place. You may not get there in time, particularly in the 97 flood case. So this is for examination of the future, the CAF command and control versus the ICS organization. That needs to be understood by both sides. There needs to be worked on there. It's always an issue for every CAF deployment. The CAF is full-time command and control. We talk about command and control every day. We do command and control. We exercise command and control. But provincial authorities are usually part-time employees. So that's an issue. The politics of who pays, what gets deployed and why. Boots on the is appreciated by the Canadian population, even though most of the Canadian population doesn't really understand what the CAF does. When they see boots on the ground, they're very appreciative. The CAF is into international operations as well. We talked about Bosnia and Sarajevo and et cetera, ongoing at the time. Somalia just previous. There's always an international component to the CAF, and the government at the time has a huge impact on the CAF and what gets deployed and employed. And at the time, the Chrétien government didn't really care how much money the CAF had. They just didn't care. They were squeezing the CAF dry for political purposes before the flood, but they didn't care. They just deployed almost the entire CAF to the Winnipeg floods because they felt they could do that, and then Chrétien called an election right in the middle of it. And then finally, CAF training for domestic ops. CAF folks are military folks and they train for military tasks. And domestic operations is not really trained for unless you're right on the spot. So if you're fighting fires and you'll have a firefighter training organization show up, train all your troops to fight fires right on the spot. There's never enough time to train CAF troops on domestic operations, and we don't have the capability to do that. So it's always an issue. The CAF is really not trained and educated on domestic operations for the most part. So that's an issue for examination too, particularly when General Ayer makes comments about the lack of CAF capability that we have in total right now, and the increased demand for domestic operations. So these are definitely issues for examination. So that's what I have for you today, and hopefully I've given you a little insight into the 97 Red River flood.
Thank you, Colonel Chris, for a wonderful recap of 1997 Winnipeg flood, one of the largest mobilization of armed forces in our country. Thank you so much for giving us the data on that. The audience, we are at the last part of our session. We intended to have a quick moderated question and answer session. So our window here is very small and very thin now, but nonetheless, it is very tempting to really interact with the presenters, and I'm going to allot another 10 minutes for this purpose. And it's a moderated session, as I have alluded to. So I would invite co-directors to kindly ask questions. And before I invite them, let me take this privilege to have the first question to our presenters. My question to actually all of you, given your wide experience and today's presentation, actually is kind of connected, interlinked. And we have discussed about the process, procedures, challenges, opportunities, and also with the case study, what it really means in terms of the deployment of armed forces for the domestic operations successfully. So the question is, we all possibly agree on the point that disasters will occur quite frequently as we move forward into the next decade. Each year, we might have to manage a large-scale disasters in terms of fire or snow or flood. So given this premise, what do you think the emerging need to develop a permanent structure in terms of command control communication and resource mobilization in our country because of the fact that we have provincial government and federal government. So what are your takes on a hypothetical structure or framework of such a cooperation in the future? I'll first invite Dr. Jack to comment, followed by Professor Christopher, and finally, of course, Colonel Chris. Sir, go ahead.
My brief response to that question would be, I think it depends what we decide as a society as to whether we want to build emergency management capacities at a sustained level provincially, or whether we want to function as we operate now, where perhaps what you said with the emerging needs and many different types of crisis we face, maybe the last resort is not something that's occasional, but the last resort keeps happening over and over again, where military forces are applied to get the job done, and they will get the job done. But what type of precedent does that set, and what does that mean for, I guess, the organizational management of as a whole, and what the military's intended purpose is to be? That would be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, similarly, I'll be brief. I think that one of the big issues is right now, because we have everything chopped up into provincial responsibility, in some senses, the rest of the country is held hostage by a particular local or regional response. So if you look at the response in the latest atmospheric river response in BC, you can imagine the 5 major highways kind of connecting British Columbia to the rest of the country. The priority of which of those highways gets repaired is a BC provincial decision, but it has a knock-on effect for Alberta. It has a knock-on effect for farmers in the prairies, etc. So how is it that we can operate like this, pretending that somehow these things are isolated disasters when actually they have a widespread, often national impact? Therefore, I think that really does not only just the frequency, but this increasing interconnectedness lends itself to finally getting a hold of and creating some kind of national framework, because really just allowing it to be done in this patchwork way across provinces, I think is going to be proven to be futile.
Thank you. Colonel Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just expand on what Jack and Christopher have already said. The voter is the bottom line in Canada, and what they're willing to vote for and pay for and resources is a question that needs to be had nationally, particularly as events arise. So it's typically a question that's not put to voters and not discussed very much. So I would argue that forums like this and other forums should increase the discussion with the Canadian voter on exactly what you want to pay for, because it's not clear to the voter times what they're actually paying for when a disaster happens and who's paying what. Second, I'll just jump on what Christopher said. A national framework, I think, would be very helpful. It's not very common knowledge that Public Safety Canada, the federal public department, is very small. They don't have a lot of they rely on with them. There's such a nation authority in Ottawa. It's not a big department that has capacity and capability. And particularly my time on the West Coast, we were always exercising the Cascadia 9.2 earthquake possibility, and our interactions with the federal, provincial, U.S., because the Cascadia fault goes through the U.S. as well. There would be significant international responses. The Red Cross would show up, and every non-governmental organization on the planet would also show up. Clowns Without Borders would definitely be there. So a federal capacity to manage that huge deployment that would have to happen for a Cascadia earthquake, for instance, would be key. And right now that capacity doesn't exist. Public Safety Canada at the federal level are really just a post office box.
Thank you, Colonel. I think it's a wonderful response. Let me also welcome now Professor Imdad Haq and Professor Nirupam Agarwal for the Q&A session. Professor Imdad, to kindly go first. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kausar Ahmed. I just want to highlight 2-3 points that came out of the discussion. One of the things that came out that in the United States, there are provisions for federal framework using National Guards and so on. But what is interesting is that the national security issues that have changed since the Cold War, because it used to be external threats, mainly from the former Soviet Union and its allies. But then it got changed, and with terrorism and New York attack in 2001 and all those things, the national security issues became more concentrated on domestic and international. So they overlap and became a lot more complex. So what we are seeing basically a kind of evolution of this complexity where nature triggered and domestic, extreme events, and then international and domestic. So we are seeing multiple layers that are going crisscross, and our institutions are really grappling with how to handle it, with these things. So in terms of resource mobilization, other things, I think in the future discussion, we need to pay attention to the cost effectiveness, because wishful thinking and the practical needs are two different things. So practically how a country, nation, while provinces, jurisdictionally and proprietary ownership-wise hold the natural resources under the BNA Act, we have a serious problem to come up with federal framework. So therefore, we need the provinces come together along with the federal. So it has to be a federal and provincial together, a combined integrated approach. Only federal is not going to work because the federal government in Canada cannot really function when they're dealing with natural resources like water, forestry, and so and so. So therefore, I think there are scopes and there are needs for that kind of dialogue and discussion, that how can we come up with this, Canadian sort of oriented because of our federal provincial relationship, which is quite interesting and quite different than the United States. We need to come up with our own framework and come up with what Dr. Ackerman, really very succinctly pointed out, so many blurred areas, but we cannot sit ducks with these blurred areas. We need to address them and come up with innovative ideas where we can deal with the future evolving complex, extreme events. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Imdad. It is a beautiful, I would say, a comment that we need to have our own framework. Let me welcome Dr. Nirupama Agarwal to kindly pose questions to the presenters, or if she decides to wrap up this session and summarizing, up to you, Professor Nirupama, because we are just overshooting our allotted time for this session.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So looking at the time, I think in the interest of the time, I'll just try to wrap it up. So thanks to Dr. Raj Dilsky, Dr. Ankerson, and Lieutenant Colonel Bowen for your very insightful presentations. Professor Raj Dilsky, you detailed some of the systems in place in the US, and obviously a useful perspective for us in Canada to reflect on and learn from. The complex web of agencies that you laid out and functions, they give us a glimpse of the level of challenges we are talking about. And Dr. Ankerson's thoughtful and deep analysis of disaster response allows us to think differently and redesign response strategies suitable for the evolving future. And like we are all talking about, it's time to think about adaptation strategies. And Lieutenant Colonel Bowen's account of 1997 Red River flood of the century, when the Canadian Armed Forces were called in to help, takes us back over 2 decades to reflect on and learn from. So again, we get a chance to appreciate the complexity of these operations. So I just want to end my remarks with some food for thought. How can Canada protect its state and society against the shifting threats of disasters? And how can Canada avoid being caught off guard by the occupation of the doorsteps of the Parliament by transport trucks for weeks? And with that, one more point to add to that. How can Canada's existing national security and emergency management institutions and frameworks adapt so the country is able to support a coordinated response to large-scale events? And with that, I thank all speakers and the moderator, Dr. Kausar Ahmed, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nirupama Agrawal, for your, I would say, very thought-provoking concluding remarks. And I think our viewers would be thinking about those comments for quite a while. Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, thanks for being with us for over 1 hour and 20 minutes or so. Our deep gratitude to all the panelists and scholars, those who came forward today and shared their insights and thoughts on this topic. Thank you very much for being with us. We want to conclude by saying that we are working in this project for the next while. And this is our first episode today aired as a platform through the webinar. And we are going to hold a couple of them in the future. So please tune in. And we are going to have this recorded webinar with the kind consent of all the presenters and the co-directors in our website, in our Facebook page. So please have a look, because there are so many points discussed. These are worth taking into consideration for the sake of our country and its safeguard and its preparedness in the future. With this kind of notes, I would like to conclude the session. Thank you so much once again. Stay well and stay safe wherever you are. Goodbye and good night.
Yeah, have a good day and good night.
Thank you.